Hi again, and welcome to episode 74 of the Bible Project, and you've reached part 5 of our series working together through the book of Genesis. And the title I've given today's podcast is Which View of Creation? And as usual, the full transcript of the message today is contained within the transcript tab in the podcast notes section of the podcast website. Most Christians agree that the beginning of all things is described in the opening section of the Bible, the one that begins with Genesis 1 verse 1 and ends in Genesis 2 verse 3. This opening section of Genesis can be divided into 3 parts. The first 2 verses stand as a sort of introduction, and in the remaining of chapter 1 covers that period of creation described as day 1 to day 6. And then in the first 3 verses of chapter 3 there's a sort of conclusion. Someone who would look at this opening section would say that it forms an introduction, followed by a description of God's work of creation, and then a conclusion and a description of the final day. What I'm going to do this time is just cover the opening single verse of Genesis chapter 1. Now don't worry, the rate at which we'll go through this book together will speed up considerably later. However, there's some really critical things we need to discuss in some depth in these opening verses. So when we look at Genesis 1:1, we notice the opening of that verse begins with it telling us that in the beginning God. Now I need to pause there for a moment already. Have you noticed the Bible starts by saying, in the beginning, God? It doesn't try and prove that statement or make any theological arguments about God's pre-existence. This opening just assumes it. Did you realize that the Bible never actually tries to argue or attempt to prove that God exists? In fact, it says elsewhere in the Bible that if you don't believe that God exists, then you're foolish. The fool in his heart has said there is no God. The Bible just assumes the existence of God, and it says it on many occasions. Then verse 1 continues, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now there are 3 radically different interpretations of these opening verses of Genesis. And before I explain them, let me qualify this by saying Christians across the centuries have at different times held on to all of these views. The first one I'm going to call the traditional view. The traditional view says that these opening verses, verses 1 and 2, are describing the original creation of the universe by God. In other words, the phrase used in verse 2 describes the condition of the earth as when it was first formed in that preceding verse 1. Therefore, when the earth was created, in verse 1, it was out without form and void. And that has been the main view for many centuries. The long-term view of Christian and Jewish commentators for well over 1,000 years was this view, before new ideas were introduced beginning about 300 years ago. Now the second view some call the gap theory. The gap theory says that verse 1, yes, it's the original creation, but then after that there's a huge gap. Then verse 2 describes what they call the recreation or the new creation. So with the gap theory, there is the original creation in verse 1, then there's a long gap in which things happen, and then there is the recreation. Now more recently, some Christians try and put evolution in the gap between verses 1 to 2. Now it's worth pointing out that this view was around a long time before people latched onto it and tried to put evolution in the gap between day 1 and 2. The viewpoint was actually most popular during the 1840s and 50s when a famous British theologian called Thomas Chambers wrote a paper on it in his attempt to harmonize Scripture as he saw it. And remember, Charles Darwin and his Origin of the Species was not even conceived until 50-60 years later in 1899. So many years before anyone had even thought of evolution, this view was popular among some Christians, particularly British Christians. So that's the second theory. Then there's a third view, and the third view has appeared more recently on the scene. The third view says that these opening verses are both describing what they say is the recreation. In the third view, the whole passage is not even mentioning the original creation. They say the descriptions of the beginning of things was way beyond Moses' purpose in writing what he wrote. And as I said earlier, the Bible just assumes that God was the beginner of all things, and no one receiving the writing of Moses at that time would have ever imagined to think otherwise. Now, me personally, I was brought up with a traditional view, and this view I still hold to this day. And in the next podcast, I shall try and explain why I believe that is the correct view, and maybe help you have a firmer idea of what it is as well. Okay everyone, that's it for this time. Now the place to go for all the links to this ministry and other ministries and podcasts that I do is the podcast notes section of this podcast on the Buzzsprout website. There you'll find links to the Facebook page, my YouTube channel, the sister podcast, the Living in Faith Everyday podcast, and also links even to my SoundCloud page where I create the background music and sound design for this podcast. And there's also, even if you're that way inclined, a place where you can support the podcast and the other ministries to the tune of £1 a month, which really helps with the funding and costs of doing this. But other than that, I really trust you've been blessed by our time together, and I hope to see you all here again very soon.